Greg, I think we just have to be brutally frank about all of this. There is absolutely no doubt that post the referendum, there is no consensus anymore in Australia on reconciliation. That's been a huge cost, a huge price that this nation has paid with the loss of the referendum.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Greg Jericho, the Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, and I'm filling in for Ebony Bennett, who's feeling a little under the weather this week. Now, believe it or not, we're not too far away from another federal election. In recent weeks, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has reshuffled his cabinet, setting up the team he'll expect to take to this election. This week, I spoke about this with a 30-year veteran of the parliamentary press gallery, Paul Bongiorno. Paul is now a columnist with the Saturday paper in the New Daily, and he joined me in the studio for the latest edition of our fortnightly webinar series on federal politics, Unparliamentary. We discussed the reshuffle, social cohesion after the change to Australia's terror alert level, gambling reform, and the Prime Minister's appearance at the Garma Festival in the Northern Territory. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks very much, Greg.
Let's get right into it. The reshuffle. The PM's decision to move Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles out of Home Affairs was the most significant, I think, decision in the cabinet shuffle. Why do you think he did this?
Well, I think he did it for several reasons, but I'd have to say the first reason was a bit of political management, frankly. I think that Albanese and Tony Burke, who of course is a key strategist, parliamentary tactician par excellence, leader of the House, they saw the way in which the opposition quite successfully weaponised the High Court decision.
A furious Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill has fronted cameras in Canberra to explain how the government plans to keep Australians safe now that a group of serious criminals has been released from immigration detention.
The Commonwealth Government did not want to do this. If I had any legal power to do it, I would keep every one of those people in detention. Some of those people have committed deplorable, disgusting crimes. I am raising 3 children in this country and I want a safe Australia.
The Justices stating a 2004 case allowing indefinite detention was incomplete and accordingly inaccurate, in that it didn't take into account a situation where someone couldn't be deported because no other country would take them in.
We are moving quickly to finalise a tough preventative detention regime before Parliament rises.
The government won't want any public perception that border controls have been weakened, but the High Court decision means there'll be no easy fix.
I think it doesn't matter where you look at the moment across this government. The wheels are falling off.
One of the problems there was there were 2 ministers on the floor of the House there to answer questions. And Andrew Giles, who is an intelligent, compassionate man, he's one of these sort of guys that always looks like he's startled. And also his default position isn't to go for the juggler. The other interesting negative for him, which I'm sure many of our audience wouldn't think is a negative, Giles actually has a reputation as being a human rights lawyer who worked quite hard for the Tampa refugees. These were the refugees that John Howard weaponised ahead of the 2001 election. And Peter Dutton and others would throw that in. Oh, his heart's not in it. He doesn't really want to keep the place safe. However, I think that was quite secondary to the other realisation that Labor really wasn't happy with this giant Home Affairs department anyway. They started to repatriate sections of it back to the Attorney General, for example, the AFP. And in the reshuffle, ASIO went back to the Attorney General. There are a few more little nips and tucks probably needed there. But I think the main takeout then became that there was only going to be one minister on the floor of the House answerable to the Home Affairs and, more importantly, I think, immigration as well. And anyone who's ever watched Tony Burke on the floor of the House, he's probably the best performer, certainly in the government. He thinks on his feet, he's articulate, and, well, he's politically savvy.
Yeah, and certainly in the industrial affairs portfolio that he had carriage over, he certainly has probably delivered some of the biggest policy wins for the government, certainly in terms of bringing in a broader range of enterprise bargaining that, for I think a lesser performer could have been a trap of, we're going back to the 70s and everything, whereas he was able to pretty deftly kill any of that sort of concerns and I think, and also delivering the employment white paper. So he's certainly seen as a winner. Is it, though, a bit of a poison chalice in being handed home affairs and immigration, or is it just a case of they needed a winner in that portfolio?
Well, it's a big job, and it has pitfalls. And one of the issues surrounding it, which I think fed into the decision, is that the political default position of the Conservatives is, I think it's undeserved, but it's still there, that they're the ones that are serious about border security and keeping Australians safe. So a Labor government has to really be on its mettle and on its game to at least neutralise that, if not show it up for being, at least debatable.
Yeah, also Claire O'Neill, she's very quickly trying to say this is not a demotion, going from Home Affairs, a fairly major portfolio, to now being in charge of, in a sense, homelessness and housing. What's your view of that? Is it a bit of a demotion, or is it a case of the government realises actually housing and homelessness is actually a pretty big issue and will be a big issue coming up to the election, so we need someone to really get onto that?
Well, it's certainly not a demotion from 2 points of view, really. She's still in cabinet, and as you've just pointed out, housing and homelessness is a key battlefront, really, in the lead up to the election. It's being pursued very successfully by the Greens, Max Chandler-Mather, and even though the opposition is coming at it from another angle, from not a supply side, but a demand side, and we can talk about that a bit later. Yeah. It is a burning issue, and it does need someone in there. Another point, I think, about Claire O'Neill, you see, she wasn't the shadow minister in opposition. The shadow minister in opposition was lost her seat at the federal election. And she was
Keneally.
Christina Keneally. God, I could see her, but I couldn't think of it. Christina Keneally was, and she was right on top of that brief. So O'Neill came in, if you like, cold as the new minister, whereas Tony Burke had been twice before the immigration minister. So he brought with him the sort of experience that O'Neill hadn't. But having said that, talking to people who worked with her, and I noticed that Abul Rizvi, the former Deputy Secretary of the Immigration Department, is highly praiseworthy of the job O'Neill was doing there, cleaning up what Rizvi and others, we've had 3 independent inquiries pointing out that basically Home Affairs and Immigration was a mess, thanks to the way in which Dutton primarily had been dealing with it.
Yeah, and that's a thing that I think people might have forgotten, is that Home Affairs is a new portfolio, really. It was only brought in under Malcolm Turnbull as what most saw was almost a bit of a gift to Peter Dutton to keep him quiet.
Yeah.
Didn't quite work as planned. Yeah. Kind of give someone more power so they'll be less of a powerful figure. Seems an odd way to go about things. But there was a lot of controversy and pushback on actually creating such a massive portfolio to cover all these disparate sort of events. And you're right, it does seem like Labor, they're not getting rid of the name, but they're shaving it away. Yeah.
Yep.
So, you point to Tony Burke, who was a former Minister for Immigration. How do you think the opposition are going to tackle immigration as we know they always will in the run-up to the election? How are they going to use Tony Burke as the new guy who they have to combat? Are they going to keep the same tack, or are they going to take a different one that they had under against Giles?
Well, I look for every opportunity to attack the government and therefore Burke. They'll have to be a bit more careful, and they know if they punch him, going to a biblical reference, if they punch him on one side of the face, they're just likely to get hit back on both.
Yeah.
He won't be turning the cheek by any means. But as I say, they would see it as a default position for them, a strength for them, that what they'll try to pursue. But they'll just probably have to be fairly astute in the way in which they do it. Having said that, it's interesting that there's a bit of dovetailing with immigration and housing, because the popular perception is, and in a sense the lazy go-to attack is you blame immigration for the housing shortage, and already Michael Sukkar, the shadow minister, has been doing that, saying, oh, well, Claire O'Neill's now going to housing to try and clean up the mess that she started with the immigration, whereas people in both Home Affairs and Immigration will tell you that the housing shortage didn't begin this year or all last year. You could probably go back 20 years or more when federal governments and state governments stopped building houses. And talking to Claire O'Neill's people, one of the things that she's highly aware of, and from discussions with the economic team of the government, is that she has to push very strongly that the real issue here is a supply side issue, that the government has actually put $32 billion out there, that it is negotiating with the states and territories, and that even some of the other quick answers, for example, that the Greens are coming up with, for example, on capital gains tax and negative gearing, even if they did it, that wouldn't solve the supply side immediately. It's not as if there's a magic wand here. And therefore, O'Neill will there'll be a lot of pressure on her to show that, hang on, unlike what the charges that the Greens are making of us, or that the opposition is making of us, and perhaps first-home buyers and others who can't get a rental or buy a house, we are in fact doing something. Now it's a hard ask, but that's her task.
Yeah, and your point on it being a long-term problem is certainly well made. I mean, it's something that we here have been looking at, and I've written on a number of times. I mean, back in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s, public housing was around anywhere between 10 and 15% of new builds were public housing. Yeah. Now it's less than 2%. And it's been less than 2% since pretty much the GFC, since around 2013. And you're right, it's hard to turn that ship around, but coming up to the election, being told, oh, it's hard to turn that ship around is not a winning strategy. So you need someone who at least can prosecute that. I think all of this talk about immigration, about housing and all this leads into our next topic of social cohesion, which very much I think they collide.
Let's get some reaction now to the lifting of Australia's terror threat level.
Raised from possible to probable. ASIO judging a greater than 50% chance of an attack in the next 12 months.
Fuelled by isolation and grievance among young men, there's been 8 separate attacks or plots since April. Intelligence chiefs tonight calling on the community for help.
But the advice that we've received is that more Australians are embracing a more diverse range of extreme ideologies, and it is our responsibility to be vigilant.
This trend increased during COVID, gained further momentum after the terrorist attacks in Israel, and accelerated during Israel's military response. An escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, particularly in southern Lebanon, would inflict further strain, aggravating tensions and potentially fuelling grievances.
We saw this week ASIO raising the threat level from possible to probable, which they were quick to state it does not mean it definitely will happen, but as soon as you start talking that probable things are probably going to happen, that does get concerning.
Well, I'm no mathematician, but I noticed that Burgess, the head of ASIO, he said it means that there's a more than 50% chance that something is going to happen. I was talking to a few people in the government, and they're a bit suspicious that maybe ASIO thinks that something more than that, but it doesn't want to scare the horses. Well, we don't know, so we're not to be alert. We're not to be alert and alarmed anymore, as John Howard
be
used to say.
Alert, not alarmed, or something.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be aware but not afraid.
Yeah, well, hopefully they're not all going to be sending out the fridge magnets again.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I could probably find my old fridge magnet.
Yeah. I mean, the statement from ASIO and from the Prime Minister was that this was all part of a rise in polarisation that we're seeing in Australia and Western nations, and very much coming out of the I think we can just say the war on Gaza, and that being a significant driver. And I think crucially, it was, I think, made clear that it's not just one side. It's both sides here, where they weren't suggesting that it's just Islamophobic concerns or Zionist concerns. It was just the overall polarisation that's occurring. How do you think the government is doing in its attempts to calm tensions, and what do you think it can do to try and calm these tensions?
Okay, well, look, the threat levels on is multidimensional. So the Gaza situation is definitely, a factor, maybe a major factor, but there are others because did you notice that the Director General also was talking about young males and gaming? See, older people like myself and maybe even you, Greg, aren't aware that these kids, teenagers and perhaps into the early, they're on these games and they're very brutal games. Like it's how many people you've killed and how many times and it's all there and it's all a game. And the trouble is when fantasy crosses over into reality. So that's a big dimension. But coming back to the issue of social cohesion when it comes to Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, well, the fact of the matter, just on the balance of things, the Palestinian, Arab and Muslim community in Australia is 10 times bigger than the Jewish community. So you've got around about 1 million people that fit into that category. But on both sides, you've got people with relatives and friends in the Middle East, in Israel or in the Palestinian territories, that are very invested just at that level. But there's another issue too that I'm sure people have noticed, that the opposition has taken a one-sided view of the conflict. They're all in with Israel. I can't remember any criticism that Peter Dutton or any of his front bench have made of the way in which the Netanyahu government is waging that war. And I think this also ups the political heat. It sort of becomes in a part of the culture war, a touchstone. And I think that this is dangerous. I know the Greens are highly critical of this raising of the threat level, and they accuse Albanese of trying to stifle their criticism of the way in which Israel is handling the war and their criticism of the Albanese government for not being more forthright in the way in which it maybe could put pressure on Israel. So all of that is there, and it is true in a contested democracy like our own, people should be free to criticise, but I suppose the warning here is, well, when you criticise, don't, for example, say that the Australian government is responsible for every Israeli bomb that falls. I think that this can raise tensions and this can make people angry. One of the things I noticed that Burgess from ASIO was pointing out is that in many ways they're flying blind because, say, someone who is emotionally fraught about the issue, say even outside the Prime Minister's office or somewhere else, if their emotions get the better of them, they break the front window and storm in, and they might inadvertently hit one of the staffers over the head. You know what I mean? So it's even down at that level that we're actually talking about.
And what we're seeing certainly in the UK at the moment is that actually and this I think goes very well with our talk about immigration, where I think we can certainly say the media, but certainly coming off the election where there was a fairly disgraceful rhetoric and policies, to be honest, around migration in the UK.
Yeah.
And I think going to what you're talking about, the online culture, where you've got these, especially young males, very much egged on by these alt-right figures.
Yep.
And it has broken out in some fairly major violence, where it's there's certainly no intent of peaceful protest. They're out to do harm. And I guess if you're ASIO, you'd be looking over at that. And we're talking about this. It's easy to think, it's all due to Gaza, but actually, if you look over in what's happening in the UK, that's sort of a part of it, but there's a whole lot of other simmering tensions. And
it's
so,
racism and immigration, without a doubt.
Exactly.
And for example, what seemed to have triggered the riots now in Britain was people like Nigel Farage and others assuming off the top that the assailant was Muslim. Now, the assailant didn't turn out to be Muslim, but he did turn out to be black.
Yeah.
And this, again, feeds into that racial attitude that is being fostered by the alt-right, the skinheads and all of the rest of them. And this is the real danger that is there, but it's certainly here as well.
Absolutely. So, yeah, it's certainly something that it's always a case with these. It was, I guess, easier under the Howard years, when you were talking about threat levels, it was pretty much just in relation to the war on terror and things like this, whereas now it's a little bit more multifaceted and just assuming, this has got something to do with tensions in the Middle East. It's, might actually have tensions with far-right groups here in Australia.
Migration has always been fraught. I remember going back, it fed into One Nation and Hanson, but there used to be Australians Against Further Immigration. They were fairly well below the radar in those days, but they used to pull 7% of the vote in general elections. So it's always there. One of the great success stories of Australia as a multicultural society is that right from the get-go post-war, immigration was seen as a positive and a good. Populate or perish and all of that. The danger we've got now with the narratives and the culture wars surrounding Israel, Gaza, Muslims, Middle Eastern people and all of that is that immigration and migration has become a negative, and it even feeds into the economic debate now. Well, we could talk about population and all of that, but business in Australia will point to the fact if you didn't have immigration and even the levels that we've seen raised in the last couple of years, well, we'd be in recession.
And on the topic of social cohesion and actually sort of a multicultural society, a big event this week was the Garma Festival, where the Prime Minister attended and Peter Dutton notably did not. But that doesn't mean it was all smooth sailing for the Prime Minister. And, of course, this was the first Garma Festival since the Voice referendum, so tensions were always going to be pretty high because of just I think we can rightly say, the upset that was caused by or that came out of the failure of the referendum. The Prime Minister reiterated his support in principle for the concept of Makarrata, but he kind of seemed to hedge it, or
he slipped sliding away.
Slipped sliding. He kind of, someone said, he's white-splaining what it means, and he's sort of talking about, it's a coming together after a struggle where many Indigenous leaders and people are saying, actually, we're talking about truth and treaty process. That was a central element of the Uluru Statement. Why do you think he's hedging here? Why do you think he's not sort of fully supporting what was in the Uluru Statement?
Greg, I think we just have to be brutally frank about all of this. There is absolutely no doubt that post the referendum, there is no consensus anymore in Australia on reconciliation. The failure of the referendum has set back racial harmony between the majority of Australians of whatever stripe and the Indigenous or First Nations people. That's been a huge cost, a huge price that this nation has paid with the loss of the referendum. Now, having said that, and to give weight to that statement, you are now seeing Peter Dutton and his shadow minister Jacinta Price. Just by the by, Dutton, as twice in news conferences on Friday and on the weekend, has dropped Nampijinpa. She's now Jacinta Price. Now, he may have forgotten or he can't remember how to pronounce it. But the message is, look, there'll be no Makarrata, there'll be no truth-telling, there'll be no advancing treaty. We're just interested in being practical, and we're not going to things like Garma, which is just all grandstanding. And Jacinta Price has even got the point that she said she didn't go there. It's all about grandstanding. I'm not interested in words. I'm interested in action. Now, that can be superficially attractive, except what we have to remember in all of this, and I can remember having a long discussion with Warren Snowden, who was the long-time member for Lingiari. And, I mean, he wept, almost tears of blood when Labor lost the election, and a number of programs that were being advanced in Lingiari, in the Northern Territory, were cut. And while Jacinta Price was the deputy mayor of Alice Springs, starting with the Abbott government, but followed up by other coalition governments over those 9 years, funding was cut substantially. And you'd have to say, well, you were there for 9 years. You played an important part. And apart from demonising Aboriginal culture, what did you do? And how did you do it? So it is, again, disturbing, particularly to me, when I saw in the Sydney Morning Herald on Saturday quotes from Price that basically there's nothing special about Indigenous Australians. They should be treated like all other Australians, and their problems are issues that all Australians have to deal with, and we deal with it in that way. Well, this is assimilationism writ large. When Pauline Hanson made similar statements, what was it, more than 10 years ago now, well, she was roundly criticised. But now we've got Jacinta Price saying it, and because I guess she is an Indigenous Australian, people are reluctant to sort of nail it, frankly.
And of course, the problem is, it's all very nice to say that, but the problem is that they are not treated the same as others, are discriminated against and have been discriminated against for centuries. You can't just wipe away that structural racism and discrimination that have occurred by just saying, oh, well, it's all good now, we're all the same.
Well, look, precisely. I mean, basically the failure of the referendum was a failure, obviously, of Australians to grasp that there was such a thing as dispossession, that the heirs or the people that were dispossessed exist today, and much of their situation, as you say, is as a result of that, and that it would have been a unifying rather than a divisive issue if we accepted the truth of our settlement and came to terms with it. Whereas Dutton and Price now want to have nothing to do with that at all. We do have to remember that Peter Dutton didn't turn up to the apology. He said he regretted it, but he's not regretting any of it right now. Yeah. And this, I think, is then the politics of the situation now. Dutton was able to successfully say that Albanese was more worried about the Voice and Makarrata than he was worried about the cost of living. And even though it wasn't true, and even though you could show what the Labor government had done in two successive budgets, that seemed to resonate out there. And I think Albanese has had to make a very hard-nosed judgment that he's not going to, between now and the next election, be painted into a corner where the only thing he's talking about is truth and treaty. But in the meantime, as we saw at Garma on the weekend, he has unveiled millions of dollars of work to address the gap, to dovetail Aboriginal communities in with Made in Australia and all of that sort of stuff, which of course the opposition is ridiculing. But I think that if you have a close, dispassionate look at it, you can argue that that this, in a way, is doing exactly what Dutton and Price are demanding.
Yeah, your point about, and I agree with you, that the Prime Minister seems would not want this to be any sort of an issue at all in the run-up to the election. The problem for those, for Indigenous people and for anyone who is pushing for truth and treaty is, in a sense, that rules out anything happening in the next term, because we've seen this term that Anthony Albanese is very big on keeping his promises, and unless it was something major like stage 3, he's not one for saying, oh, well, we didn't promise it, but we'll do it, And so if he has not actually made any commitment towards anything in the run-up to the election, it's going to be hard to get him to move in the next 3 years.
Well, I agree with that, except talking to some fairly senior people in the government, they realise they can't go to the next election as the incumbent government as a small target. They have to put something out there that will excite the Australian electorate to stick with them. And part of the thinking of Albanese was, I don't want to scare the horses. I don't want to come in and be seen as this radical Labor government that's going to destroy everything. I want to come in and, softly. A good example, is what we were talking about earlier with Tony Burke. He actually achieved enormous reform in the area of workplace relations. But you know what they did? They did it in their first year quickly when, as we know, the Senate skews left. The Greens quibbled here and there, but they were on side. The crossbench was on side, and they were able to get it through. Of course, now in the third year of our cycle, everybody, the Greens, the crossbench, the Libs, the Nats, they're all there. Look at me. And the best way to be looked at is to stand in the way of the government.
Yeah, it was really only on workplace relations where the government did seem to have a real urgency of knowing, actually, we got to do things now because your honeymoon goes and you got to use your political capital while you got it. And they probably, I think we can argue that they did sort of let a lot of it just go to waste there. Which brings us, I think, what we can talk about migration and all the other factors, but we know that when it gets to the election, everyone's going to be talking the economy. And when we talk the economy, we're talking inflation, cost of living.
Yeah, 1% for the quarter, 3.8% year on year.
The rise in headline inflation from 3.6 to 3.8% was both expected by the market and forecast by the Reserve Bank, so no surprise there.
No surprises from the RBA today. The cash rate is on hold at 4.35%, where it has been since November last year after 13 rate increases from the RBA.
The Reserve Bank has ruled out a rate cut before Christmas, warning the economy is still too hot. The cash rate was left on hold at 4.35% following days of uncertainty on the global market.
The latest inflation figures came out actually showed that even though inflation went up slightly from 3.6 to 3.8%, core inflation came down. And we're recording this an hour before the Reserve Bank comes out and tells us, but I think it would be a shock if they were to do anything other than keep interest rate low. How did the government respond to the figures, and how is their thinking about how they're going to tackle inflation and the fact that it seems unlikely there's going to be an interest rate cut very soon, but seems unlikely there's going to be a rate rise? How's that affected their planning and their thinking towards the next election?
Well, first of all, they're hoping by the next election there will be some interest rate relief. And to help that along the way, they designed packages like rent relief, energy bill relief, medicines, cheaper medicines, that everyone expects to feed into the next lot of inflation numbers, so that inflation is expected, to come down for other reasons as well, but helped along by these government measures. Greg, I'd be interested to get your view on this, but I see yesterday Gittins in the Sydney Morning Herald quoting the economists from ACOS, from the Social Security area. And of course, if anyone follows Stephen Koukoulas, he's been absolutely adamant that they should start cutting rates. And if they don't start cutting them, we'll be in a recession before we know it. And I was reading Stephen this morning. There's some interesting indicators, especially if America starts cutting rates, and especially the way in which the US market was spooked yesterday, that we're getting into very murky waters. And the numbers showing that employment in Australia is softening. It could well be that the bank will, as some economists, for example, the Westpac economists, are saying that the next figures that come out on growth will be negative. So if all this is happening, you'd imagine that the bank will have to move on rates.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we here for a very long time, and I think we were kind of lone hands. Certainly Steve Koukoulas was one who was kind of with us in that we were thinking you can't raise rates while the economy is going so slow. You only had to look at retail spending going backwards, household consumption going backwards, and even employment was mainly growing, and thankfully unemployment not rising. But when you unpick the figures, you saw most of it was coming from sort of that public non-market sector of NDI spending, education, and broader healthcare, and a bit of construction. But overall, the private sector was going, no one's out there spending. Everyone is hurting because of interest rate rises. And I think you're right. America, everyone got spooked this week because some bad unemployment figures. And it's always one of those things. Everyone wants interest rate cuts, but often the reason the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates is because the economy is doing badly.
Well, precisely.
And so I think it's more likely now that there will be a cut sooner than later than it was, say, a month ago. And certainly all of our push has been, we knew that inflation was driven initially mainly by corporate profits, by supply side factors, where due to the Ukraine invasion, due to coming out of COVID, and due to companies going, oh, it's a good time to raise prices, no one will care. And we haven't seen wages grow strongly at all. They haven't been pushing it. And it was interesting, I noticed last week, when it went up to from 3.6 to 3.8, and if that had happened a couple months ago, everyone would go, oh, see, the Reserve Bank's got to go harder. They haven't been tough enough. And yet last week everyone was like, yeah, no, they won't move. They, in fact, actually, next one's going to be a cut. It seems there has been a bit of a change in the mindset across a lot of economists that actually we have gone hard. Inflation perhaps is not the big concern at the moment. And everyone knows in politics the cost of living is always present. But another thing that is big is losing your job. And when unemployment starts rising, that's when things start turning bad for government. So I think they'll certainly be worried about that. The opposition have been trying to blame this all on the government, saying it's all homegrown inflation and that it's due to their massive spending commitments. How do you think that's landing? Is that taking some skin off the government, or do you think people are thinking, look, we know what's driving it? There's a lot of other factors here.
It's interesting that the Newgate poll on the mood of the nation last week, which I quoted in my Saturday paper column, shows that Australians do accept that government taxes, and by government they mean federal, state and local, contribute to the pain when they get their rates and all the rest of it. But they do accept all those other factors. And I'm told that research that the Labor Party has been doing is that people do accept that a lot of the problem is out of the hands of the government or the opposition. Yeah. So then, and this is where we're getting to, I think, on a whole range of things, housing including, that the acid will also, when push comes to shove, when we get to vote on who do we want going forward, people won't say, well, not all that impressed with Albanese and Chalmers maybe. Well, what are the other side offering? Now, as of today, what they are offering is scorched earth. I mean, if you take them at their word, if the spending is too great, and as Chalmers points out, what is it, the $12 billion that's there to help out with a bit of relief out of a $2 trillion economy, if that's too much, and if the 30,000 public servants you think are too many and you'll sack them all, then that comes. So you say, well, let's put all this together. So you're going to go in for austerity and severe cuts, and you're going to go in for severely cutting services. I mean, why have we got more public servants? Because services were so dire that this had to be addressed. Now, will voters accept that the alternative answer is actually, the medicine in the alternative is actually worse than what they're putting up with now with the current government? And I think that this is probably politically where we're going.
So, I mean, certainly Labor would be pointing over to the UK and seeing what happened with all the austerity over there and where they are now. And I think you can certainly lay claim to the lack of social cohesion and the riots happening over there because services have been destroyed.
Absolutely.
And inequality becomes rampant and things fall apart. There's one more topic I'd like to sort of touch on because I think it does have a bit of a chance of becoming a bit of a political hot potato, not so much because of voters, but because of the makeup of Parliament and the crossbenches, and that's of gambling reform, where last year a bipartisan committee that was chaired by the late Labor MP Peter Murphy, a wonderful MP, and just person really, recommended a blanket ban on gambling advertising. And certainly here at the Australia Institute, we have done a fair bit of polling and work on gambling advertising. And our polling has found, for example, in South Australia, that about 75% of voters were in favour of just a blanket ban on gambling advertising, that there really is no support. No one likes watching footy and up comes that gambling ad again and again. It seems to be all there is, and especially watching it with your kids and things like that. So whereas the government has come out and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to put in some conditions. Maybe we'll look
restrictions.
We'll look at digital things. And the reaction from the crossbenchers, especially David Pocock, Senator here in the ACT, has not been good. How do you think this is going to go over especially when they come back and try to actually push this legislation through?
Well, first of all, there is absolutely no doubt, and the evidence given to the Murphy Committee and listening to experts on the harm of gambling, there is no doubt that gambling is as harmful to the body politic in Australia as tobacco was. And if we could do everything in our power to deter people, especially young kids, teenagers and younger adults, from thinking that gambling was integral to sport, we would actually save billions of dollars in the way we have to deal with breakdown in families, health and all that sort of thing. So at face value, it's a complete no-brainer. Now, I'm going to become a political commentator now, right? And I'd like to remind our audience of the Tasmanian Labor Party in the 2018 state election, which found, both in its own polling and in the published polling, that Tasmanians hated pokies in pubs. They thought that people were spending all their wages in the pubs all around the state, and why don't you save families and get rid of the pokies in the pubs? So Rebecca White was the Labor leader. She thought she was on a terrific winner. But when polling day came, and after according to White, the Liberals were able to spend $5 million worth of donations coming from the pub lobby and the gambling lobby, Labor lost.
Yeah.
And part of the big argument there was, so you want Labor to pull the pokies out of all the pubs? Do you know that those pokies employ 1,000 or 2,000 people? We're talking about Tasmania. It's only the size of the ACT. So that went bang like that. Now, let me come back to this. You'd say, well, okay, we're not talking about pokies in pubs here. We're just talking about taking ads off TV. Right. This is what the Labor government has arraigned against it on this issue. Right? It's got the AFL and the NRL. Already these two major sporting codes have been banging on the door of the minister saying this is funding community sport. This is funding the terrific way in which we present the sport, and Australians love their sport. So you can imagine if the plug is pulled, they might, in the run up to an election, say, Anthony Albanese is destroying the AFL. That's one thing. Yep. The next thing you've got arraigned against them is Australia's major media outlets, particularly commercial television, who literally do have their backs to the wall and who are pitifully dependent on this revenue. Then, of course, you've got other interests in the media as well, because the commercial media is hurting badly. An example, on the new dailies had to pull back the number of columns they want me to write for it, and they've had to have retrenchments because even though I said to them, but you've got to have advertisements all over your site. He said, I know, but no one's paying enough for them. And that's what all the media, mainstream media, is finding as well. So that's what's arrayed against them. Now, I heard Jeff Kennett on Radio National this morning, the former Premier of Victoria. He said they should bite the bullet. We heard all these arguments about tobacco and sport. We should do it. And he said we had to do it at Hawthorn because he was the president of the Hawthorn Football Club. You have to just reposition the way in which you're going to fund going ahead. I do think there's a lot of strength in that argument, but I can see the sorts of pressures that a government that is 2 seats away from minority, that has been politically timid on so many fronts, would probably hate the thought of having News Corp even angrier with it. Yeah. And the mainstream, Channel 7, 9 and 10 running, pretty strong campaigns. You might have seen they've already been running a pretty rabid campaign over the fact that they're demanding that on the new smart TVs that their sites by law be put front and central, all that sort of stuff. So look, that's the broader politics of it. And the last thing to say that even though the opposition brought in, the Liberals, David Coleman brought in a private members bill last June restricting gambling, not banning it, but restricting gambling on television, so close to what the leaks seem to be suggesting the government's up to. If Albanese bit the bullet do you honestly think that Peter Dutton wouldn't join the AFL and everybody else saying, attacking the decision as what choice are you giving people? It's a free country. Why can't we gamble? And why can't legal entities like gambling, even multinational gambling companies, why can't they, in a free country, advertise? I mean, that you've got to think, as it were, 2 steps ahead of the politics of all of this.
Yeah. Well, that's where we will leave this episode of Follow the Money. Thanks to Paul Bongiorno for joining us. The discussion was recorded on Tuesday, the 6th of August, and some things may have changed. If you want to join Parliamentary Live or any of our other webinars, you can find all the details on our website, which is australiainstitute.org.au. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the discussion today. You can reach out to us via the email at podcasts, that's podcast with an S, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. Or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute, which is OzAUS. I'm Greg Jericho. Thanks for joining us.